The board of directors found them at midnight, sequestered in the mahogany-lined silence of the executive suite, with a single, open ledger lying like a smoking gun between them. The boss didn't move when the circle of loyalists and bodyguards closed around the desk. He didn't reach for the secure phone or try to call security. His eyes, those sharp, predatory eyes that had silenced entire city blocks for decades, remained fixed on the man standing just beyond the lamp's reach. "Step away from the desk, Victor." The voice that spoke was not the frantic shout of a cornered rival. It was a sentence delivered with a cold finality that made the very foundations of the building seem to tremble. It belonged to Underboss Lucien Vale, the silent architect of the family's wealth and the man who had occupied the boss's shadow for 20 years. Lucien stood at the edge of the circle, a figure of absolute, unshakable composure wrapped in a charcoal suit that looked like armor. Where the boss was exposed by the harsh glare of the desk lamp, his face a map of shock and fractured authority, Lucien remained mostly in the dark, unreadable and lethal. The heavy silence he commanded was a weapon more pointed than any blade, aimed directly at the boss's heart. The boss's response was barely a gasp, his mouth hanging open as if the air itself had turned to lead. "You wouldn't." The men in the room exchanged glances. They could all feel it. The shift in gravity, the smell of a dying regime. "The accounts are empty. The loyalty is gone. You're already a ghost, Victor." The boss's lead enforcer stepped forward, not to protect his leader, but to stand beside the man in the shadows. Victor tightened his grip on the edge of the mahogany desk, the polished wood feeling unnaturally cold against his palms. For 30 years, this room had been his fortress, a place where his word was law and his silence was a death sentence. He looked at the circle of men surrounding him, men he had handpicked, men he had paid in both gold and blood. He expected to see the familiar glint of terror in their eyes, the frantic readiness to strike down anyone who dared challenge him. But as he opened his mouth to bark the order that would end Lucien Vale's life, he realized the air had gone still. It wasn't the respectful silence of a pack awaiting their alpha's command. It was the hollow, terrifying stillness of a vacuum. He looked at Santino, his lead enforcer, a man who had been his shadow for a decade. Santino wasn't looking at Victor's face. He wasn't checking the safety on his weapon or waiting for the signal to fire. Santino was looking past him. They were all looking past him. The collective gaze of the room had shifted, sliding off Victor as if he were already a ghost, settling instead on the man standing in the half-light. The realization hit Victor like a physical blow, a sudden fracturing of the ground beneath his feet. He felt a bead of sweat track slowly down his temple, an uncharacteristic display of humanity that felt like a neon sign of his own weakness. "Santino," Victor rasped, his voice cracking, a sound he hadn't made since he was a frightened soldier in the trenches of the city's first gang war. "Take him, now." The enforcer didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The loyalty that had once felt like an unbreakable chain now looked like a thread, severed so cleanly that Victor hadn't even felt the snap. The sharp lighting of the desk lamp, which had always served to make Victor look like a god in his high chair, now only served to expose the deep lines of age on his face and the dilated pupils of a man who realized he was no longer the apex predator. Behind him, Lucien Vale didn't move. He didn't need to. The underboss simply stood there, his presence heavy and absolute, a silent command that made the very walls of the office seem to vibrate with a new authority. The power hadn't been stolen in a loud, bloody coup. It had simply drained out of Victor and pooled at Lucien's feet while the boss was busy looking the other way. Victor's mouth hung slightly open, the command dying in his throat. He looked at the circle of warriors he had built, and for the first time he saw them for what they were, a hunting party, and he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the broken thing in the center of the circle, and the man in the shadows was just waiting for him to realize the hunt was already over. Victor tried to straighten his shoulders, an instinctive attempt to fill the space of the room as he had for decades, but the very fabric of his suit felt like a betrayal. His attire, the dark, tailored jacket and the silk black tie, had always been his uniform of control, a suit of armor that signaled his formal and authoritative presence to any who entered his domain. It was the garb of a man accustomed to silencing crowds with a single look, the outward manifestation of a ruthlessness that had been carved into the lines of his forehead and the hard set of his jaw over years of pressure. For a long time, the precision of his lapels and the neatness of his dark hair had reflected the order he imposed upon the city. But as he stood trapped in the sharp glare of the desk lamp, the uniform felt like a tailored cage. The ruthless leadership that had once made him an apex predator had, stitch by stitch, isolated him from the very men now surrounding him. Every decision made without mercy, and every command issued through fear had built a wall between him and the world, leaving him unguarded and human for the first time in his life. He realized too late that, while he was busy perfecting his image of dominance, he had become a relic of a dying regime, a man holding a title while the actual leverage of the streets had flowed into the shadows behind him. The deep creases around his eyes, once marks of a leader who saw everything, now looked like the fractures in an old statue. He was surrounded by his hand-picked warriors, yet he had never been more alone. His authority was visibly fractured, his pupils dilated with the sudden understanding that his power was not a part of him, but something that had been lent to him by the men who were now looking at Lucien Vale. The stillness of the room was a cold reminder that a king without the loyalty of his subjects is just a man in an expensive suit, waiting for the silence to end. The stillness in the executive suite deepened as Lucien Vale finally shifted, the movement so fluid and controlled it seemed to pull the very darkness with him. He stepped just far enough forward for the edge of the desk lamp's glow to catch the sharp line of his jaw, yet he remained partially in shadow, a ghost manifesting into a king. His posture was calm, a stark contrast to Victor's visibly fractured authority. Lucien didn't need the spotlight. His power was implied, a quiet authority that had been gestating in the corners of every smoke-filled room and back alley deal for a decade. "You built the walls, Victor," Lucien said, his voice a low, steady vibration that carried more weight than any of the boss's previous shouts. "But I built the foundation." As Lucien spoke, the realization began to sink into Victor's dilated pupils. While the boss had been playing the role of the ruthless leader, maintaining the uniform of control and preening for the board, Lucien had been the one keeping the gears turning. It was Lucien who had quieted the unions when they whispered of rebellion. It was Lucien who had laundered the pride of the family through legitimate fronts, while Victor was busy making public examples of minor thieves. The shadows surrounding Lucien felt intentional, almost symbolic of the years he spent being the true architect of their empire. He had already said what needed to be said through years of quiet efficiency, and now he was simply waiting for the consequences to unfold. The men in the circle, the warriors and enforcers, didn't look at Lucien with fear, but with a terrifying, silent recognition. They weren't seeing an usurper. They were looking at the man who had actually been paying their salaries, protecting their families, and running the city while the man in the chair was distracted by the weight of his own crown. Lucien angled his head slightly, his eyes unreadable and contained. The leverage wasn't in the boss's hands. It never had been. The man in the foreground held the title, but the man in the shadows held the truth. Victor's mouth hung frozen, the realization dawning that he had been a figurehead in his own kingdom, a lion in a cage that Lucien had been kind enough to leave unlocked until tonight. The transition wasn't coming. It had already happened years ago, and Victor was the last person in the city to find out. Victor lunged forward, his hand slamming onto the mahogany desk in a desperate bid to reclaim the room's wavering gravity. He had survived 3 decades of betrayal and street wars by being the loudest, coldest voice in every room, and he reached for that familiar, ruthless authority now. He drew air into his lungs, chest swelling beneath the tailored cage of his suit, preparing to unleash a command that should have seen Lucien Vale's head on the desk before the sentence was even finished. "Santino, end this," Victor roared, his finger stabbing toward the man in the shadows. Kill him now or you're next." In the past, those words would have vibrated with a command that made the very air vibrate with authority. It was a voice that had once commanded rooms and silenced crowds. But as the echoes of his shout hit the walls and bounced back, they sounded hollow, thin, and desperate. The ceremonial power of his voice, the invisible iron that had held his syndicate together, was gone. Santino didn't move. The lead enforcer didn't even reach for his holster. Instead, he simply adjusted his stance, his shoulders squared not toward the boss in the light, but toward the underboss in the shadows. The rest of the guards followed suit, their eyes locked in a silent, dilated disbelief as they watched the man they once feared unravel in the glare of the lamp. Victor's mouth stayed open, frozen mid-breath as he tried to find a second command, but the words wouldn't come. He looked like a king holding a ceremonial spear that had finally snapped in his hands. He realized too late that the men in this room weren't his warriors anymore. They were witnesses to his funeral. "They can't hear you, Victor," Lucien said softly, his voice cutting through the boss's frantic energy with a quiet, final authority. "You've been shouting at ghosts for years." Victor's hand trembled on the desk, his authority visibly fractured. He looked around the circle of stone-faced men and saw only the sudden understanding that power had slipped from his grasp. The room remained silent, a heavy, suffocating stillness that confirmed the boss's greatest fear. He was still the man in the suit, but he was no longer the man in charge. The command hadn't just failed, it had proven that he was already obsolete. Victor's lungs burned as he searched for one more threat, one more scrap of dominance to hurl at the silent circle. He looked at Lucien, who stood with his head slightly angled, waiting with the agonizing patience of an executioner. The underboss finally stepped fully into the light, his face showing no visible emotion, no urgency, no heat, only a terrifying, quiet authority. "You keep looking for your soldiers, Victor," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than the boss's roar. "But you should have been looking at your son." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Victor's hands, which had been white-knuckled against the mahogany, suddenly went limp. The betrayal he had spent a lifetime looking for in the shadows of the streets hadn't come from a rival or a rogue enforcer. It had been bred in his own home. "Leo didn't just give me the ledgers," Lucien continued, his calm posture a stark contrast to Victor's fracturing composure. "He gave me the keys to the offshore accounts and the names of the judges you thought you owned. He didn't want your throne, Victor. He wanted to be free of the man who turned his life into a war zone." The boss's mouth hung slightly open, frozen mid-breath. The ground beneath him hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated. The uniform of control he wore, the dark suit and formal tie, now felt like a shroud. The shock in his wide eyes and his dilated pupils exposed every twitch of his sudden understanding. He had been fighting for a legacy that his own blood had already dismantled. The truth was a finality that required no response. Victor tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, his authority visibly fractured beyond repair. He looked at Lucien and saw the man who didn't need to display power because he simply held it. The underboss had already said what needed to be said, and the boss, reduced to a vulnerable and human shell, could only stare into the darkness where his empire used to be. Victor stared at Lucien, but the office walls seemed to dissolve into the ghosts of the past decade. He remembered the nights he had spent in this very chair, drunk on the adrenaline of his own ruthless decisions, ordering hits that scorched the city and signing decrees that bled his rivals dry. He had always felt like the sun at the center of the solar system, unaware that while he was busy burning, Lucien was the gravity holding everything together. Lucien remembered those nights differently. He had spent them in the shadows of the club basements and the back rooms of shipping yards, simply waiting for the consequences of Victor's ego to unfold. While Victor was making public examples of those who showed a flicker of defiance, Lucien was the one catching the fallout. He was the one who sat with the widows of the men Victor had discarded, offering them a pension and a promise of safety in exchange for a loyalty that Victor never thought to ask for. He recalled the moment 3 years ago when Victor had ordered the firebombing of the docks to prove a point to the unions. Victor had watched the flames from his penthouse, savoring the heat of his own power. But Lucien had been on the ground, watching the workers' faces. He didn't stop the fire, but he ensured every man who lost his livelihood that night was given a new role within his own silent network. He had moved through the soot and the screams with a quiet authority, a ghost among the ruins, planting seeds of a new order while Victor was busy admiring the ash. Every time Victor had chosen fear, Lucien had chosen leverage. Every time Victor had demanded blood, Lucien had collected a debt. The underboss had lived 1,000 lives in the periphery of Victor's vision, angled slightly away so the boss would never see the lack of urgency in his eyes. He had been the one to comfort Victor's son, Leo, after the boy had been struck for showing Omega-like hesitation in a negotiation. Lucien hadn't argued. He had simply waited in the hall, offering the boy the silent, unreadable composure that Victor mistook for submission. Now, as the lighting cut sharply across Victor's fractured features, the weight of those 1,000 moments finally pressed down on the room. Victor had been the storm, loud, violent, and temporary. Lucien had been the tide, patient and absolute. The consequences hadn't arrived tonight. They had been arriving for 10 years, one quiet conversation at a time. Victor was finally seeing the truth. He hadn't been ruling a kingdom. He had been occupying a room while Lucien owned the city. The silence in the room shifted from a vacuum of shock to a heavy, collective decision. Victor watched, his breathing shallow and jagged, as the hierarchy he had spent a lifetime cementing with fear dissolved in the span of a few heartbeats. It began with Santino, the man who had been Victor's right hand, the one who had carried out the most ruthless of the boss's commands, made a slow, deliberate movement. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't utter a word of protest. Instead, he bowed his head toward the shadows where Lucien Vale stood, a gesture of submission so profound it felt like the floor had finally vanished beneath Victor's feet. One by one, the other loyalists followed. The guards at the door, the men who had stood as silent sentinels of Victor's power, shifted their shoulders and averted their eyes. Their heads dipped in a synchronized wave of recognition, a silent coup that required no gunfire, no shouting, and no blood. They weren't looking at the man in the sharp light of the desk lamp anymore. They were acknowledging the man who held the truth and the leverage. The loyalty they had once offered Victor, a loyalty built on the brittle foundation of terror, had been replaced by a quiet, immovable respect for the underboss who had protected them when the boss would have discarded them. Victor felt the weight of his tailored suit pull at his frame, no longer armor but a heavy, empty costume. His authority was visibly fractured, exposed by the harsh glare that now made him look small and fragile against the vast darkness of the room. For the first time in 30 years, the boss was vulnerable and human, stripped of the ceremonial power of his title. He was a man holding a dead phone in a room full of people who no longer heard his voice. His mouth hung slightly open, the muscles in his face twitching as he looked at the tops of their heads. He wanted to scream, to demand they look at him, to remind them of the things he had done to build this empire. But the words died in his throat. The stillness was absolute. The men he had trained to be wolves had turned their backs on the old lion, choosing instead the quiet authority of the man who didn't need to roar to be obeyed. Victor stood alone in the center of the circle, an abandoned relic of a forgotten era, while the power of the city flowed silently into the shadows at Lucien's feet. Lucien Vale moved with a slow, rhythmic grace, circling the desk until he stood directly in front of the man who had been his master for a lifetime. The sharp light of the desk lamp now divided them like a border, Victor trapped in the white-hot exposure of his failure, and Lucien wreathed in the cool, unshakable calm of the shadows. The underboss didn't gloat. There was no fire in his eyes, only the clinical, quiet authority of a man who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. "You've spent 30 years looking for an ending that involves a bullet, Victor," Lucien said, his voice a steady hum that seemed to soothe the jagged tension of the room. You expected to go out in a blaze of glory, a martyr to your own ruthlessness. But the city doesn't want your blood. It just wants you to be gone. Victor looked up, his pupils still dilated, his face a map of sudden human vulnerability. The uniform of control hung off his frame, the fabric seemingly too heavy for the man beneath it. He was a ghost haunting his own throne, a relic of an era that had been replaced by a more efficient, silent machinery. "I'm giving you the one thing you never gave anyone else," Lucien continued, his head slightly angled as he watched the realization sink into Victor's features. "A way out. There is a villa in the north far from the borders of this territory. It has no phones, no guards, and no throne. You will leave tonight. You will take the suit, the name, and the memories, but you will never speak a command again." It was the ultimate loss of power, not a violent death, but a quiet, forced irrelevance. Lucien was offering him a retirement in exile, a slow fading away that was more terrifying to a man like Victor than any execution. It was the finality of a closed ledger. Victor's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The ceremonial power that had once silenced crowds was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of the truth. He looked at Lucien and saw a reflection of the man he should have been, someone who didn't need to display power because he was power. "The car is waiting," Lucien whispered, the words a final, soft decree. "The men will see you to the door, not as your protectors but as your ushers." Victor stood, his legs trembling slightly. He looked one last time at the mahogany desk and the circle of warriors who had already turned their backs on him. He walked toward the door, a broken king entering the long, cold night of his own shadow, leaving the throne to the man who had been ruling from the darkness all along. The door clicked shut behind the ghost of Victor, the sound echoing through the office like the final strike of a gavel. For a moment, the room remained suspended in that heavy, mahogany-scented silence, the air still vibrating with the vacuum left by a fallen empire. Lucien Vale stood motionless at the edge of the desk, his silhouette partially in shadow, before he finally moved into the center of the sharp, unforgiving light. He did not rush to the high-backed leather chair. He did not preen or adjust his cuffs. Instead, he reached out and touched the surface of the desk, feeling the coldness of the wood where Victor's frantic hands had recently been. He sat down slowly, not with the aggressive entitlement of a conqueror, but with the weary, quiet authority of a man assuming a heavy burden. The lighting, which had exposed every fracture and twitch of fear in Victor's face, now settled on Lucien's features, revealing a face that was unreadable, contained, and absolute. Santino and the others did not wait for a command. They stepped forward in unison, a circle of predatory power that had finally found its true north. There was no shouting, no displays of battle-scarred muscle, just the terrifying efficiency of men who finally understood who they were serving. Lucien looked at the ledger still lying open, the small and broken thing that had served as the instrument of the coup. He realized then that the strength Victor had championed was nothing more than a ceremonial spear, carved from ancient ironwood but hollow at its core. To rule through fear alone was a slow suicide. It was a form of cruelty that eventually turned every loyalist into an executioner. Strength without compassion was just a blunt instrument, yet he knew that in this world, order still required a steady, uncompromising hand. He looked up, his eyes catching the light. They weren't molten with the golden rage of a wolf, but they possessed a deep, obsidian clarity. He saw the men before him not as tools to be broken, but as a pack that had been starved of a leader they could trust. "The old ways died with the man who just left this room," Lucien said, his voice a low, steady vibration that made the very air feel solid again. "We are no longer a kingdom of fear. We are a syndicate of debt and honor. Every man here is accounted for. Every family is protected. But if the foundation is threatened, my hand will be far heavier than his ever was." The warriors bowed their heads, a finality that marked the end of the transition. The underboss was gone. In his place sat a king who had learned to rule from the shadows, A man who understood that the most powerful thing in the world wasn't a roar or a crown, but the silent, unshakable truth of a promise kept. Outside, the city continued to breathe, unaware that its heart had been replaced, while inside the office, Lucien Vale picked up the pen and began to write the first chapter of a new, quieter reign.